The moment federal authorities took full control of this investigation, everything changed, and not in a way that made the public feel more confident. A U.S. citizen, a mother of three, is dead after an immigration operation in Minneapolis. Within hours, responsibility for the case was shifted away from state investigators and placed solely in federal hands. Officials at the highest levels immediately described what happened as self-defense. Local leaders said the evidence told a different story, and now, the question isn't just what happened that day, but who gets to decide the truth when federal power investigates itself. According to publicly available information, the FBI has assumed exclusive control over the investigation into the death of Renee Nicole Good in Minneapolis. Initially, Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the state agency typically responsible for independent reviews of officer-involved shootings, was involved. That changed abruptly. State officials later confirmed they were removed from the process. They no longer had access to evidence, witnesses, or investigative materials. The reason given was jurisdiction. The reaction from Minneapolis city leaders was immediate. They described the move as deeply concerning and called for transparency, emphasizing that public trust depends on independent oversight, especially in cases involving federal agents. This decision alone became a turning point, not just legally, but politically, and it happened while national leaders were already publicly framing the narrative. Before a full investigation could unfold, senior federal officials and political figures described the incident as a justified act of self-defense. They claimed the woman posed a threat during a large-scale immigration operation. They asserted that an agent feared serious harm. However, those claims were made while video footage of the incident was already circulating online. Footage that, according to local officials and observers, appeared to contradict key parts of that explanation. This gap between official statements and publicly available visuals became the fuel for growing public tension. Minnesota's governor openly questioned whether a federal-only investigation could deliver an outcome the public would see as fair. His concern wasn't framed as an accusation, but as a warning about credibility, because once conclusions are announced before an investigation concludes, trust becomes difficult to restore. Multiple videos recorded by bystanders began circulating shortly after the incident. According to those recordings, the woman was inside her vehicle when federal officers approached. She appeared to maneuver her car in an attempt to leave the area. At least one officer is seen issuing commands. Moments later, shots are fired. The vehicle then continues forward and comes to a stop after striking fixed objects nearby. What's important here is not interpretation, but uncertainty. The footage does not clearly establish intent. It does not conclusively show whether the agent was struck, and it does not resolve whether lethal force was unavoidable. That ambiguity is exactly why independent investigations exist, which is why the removal of state investigators became such a central issue. As details emerged, reactions across Minnesota escalated quickly. The governor reiterated that the state deserved a role in determining the facts. Members of Congress condemned the incident and questioned federal accountability. The mayor of Minneapolis called for calm, while also sharply criticizing federal enforcement tactics in his city. National political figures responded differently. Some defended the agent involved and echoed early claims of self-defense. Others accused federal leadership of shaping a narrative before all evidence had been reviewed. The divide wasn't just partisan, it was institutional. Federal authority versus local governance. National messaging versus community trust. And Minneapolis found itself at the center of that clash. In the days that followed, Minneapolis officials took extraordinary steps. Public school classes were canceled due to safety concerns. Large demonstrations were announced across the city. Community leaders urged unity and restraint. Thousands of residents gathered peacefully, holding signs and calling for accountability rather than confrontation. Religious leaders from multiple faiths stood together, emphasizing solidarity and nonviolence. Despite heightened emotions, most demonstrations remained calm. The message from organizers was consistent. This was about oversight, not chaos. But tensions remained high, not only in Minneapolis, but nationwide. Protests soon spread to other U.S. cities. Calls for federal reform grew louder. Questions about the role of immigration enforcement in local communities resurfaced. At the center of it all remains a single unresolved issue. When a federal agent is involved in the death of a civilian, who can investigate in a way the public truly trusts? Because without transparency, facts become disputed, and without trust, even verified outcomes can be rejected. This case isn't just about one operation in one city. It's about accountability, jurisdiction, and the limits of power within a moment when public confidence is already fragile. But as public pressure increased, another detail quietly entered the conversation: the identity of the agent involved. And once that became public, the debate shifted again, not toward closure, but toward even deeper questions. Court documents later identified the ICE agent involved as Jonathan E. Ross, a Minneapolis resident and a veteran member of a specialized federal enforcement unit. Federal authorities did not immediately confirm his identity. It was first reported by local media using publicly available records. According to those documents, Ross had years of experience in immigration enforcement operations. Supporters of the federal response emphasized that experience, describing him as trained and seasoned. Critics asked a different question. If this was a routine operation involving an experienced agent, how did it escalate to a fatal outcome in a matter of seconds? That question became central, especially as more footage surfaced. Days later, another recording began circulating. This video appeared to be filmed from the perspective of the agent involved. According to reports, it was recorded on a mobile device. The footage captures moments of verbal exchange before the shooting. Voices are raised, commands are issued, then the sound of gunfire. Importantly, the video does not provide a full, unobstructed view of the vehicle's movement. It cuts out quickly and leaves critical moments unseen. Some viewers said it supported federal claims of perceived danger. Others said it reinforced doubts about whether lethal force was necessary. Once again, the footage did not resolve the core issue. It intensified it. Federal officials maintained that the agent acted in self-defense, stating that he believed the vehicle posed an imminent threat. Local leaders, after reviewing the same publicly available footage, said that conclusion was far from settled. The disagreement wasn't over whether something serious happened, but over how it should be legally and ethically interpreted. That distinction matters, because intent, perception, and proportional response are evaluated differently depending on who is doing the evaluating, and in this case, the evaluator is now exclusively federal. Minnesota's governor publicly expressed doubt that an investigation led solely by federal authorities would be seen as impartial. His concern was echoed by other state officials who pointed out that the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the agency normally tasked with these cases, had been removed entirely. Federal officials disputed the characterization, stating that jurisdiction naturally fell under federal oversight. But to many residents, the explanation didn't address the core concern. Why exclude state investigators when transparency was most needed? That question remained unanswered. As days passed, demonstrations in Minneapolis changed shape. Large rallies gave way to smaller, more persistent gatherings. Marches moved through downtown streets. Vigils formed near the location of the incident. Organizers emphasized peaceful expression and community safety. The messaging focused less on anger and more on accountability. Participants called for independent review clarity around federal authority and long-term changes to enforcement practices. Law enforcement maintained a visible presence, and while tensions occasionally rose, widespread violence was avoided. That restraint became a defining feature of the moment. What began as a local tragedy quickly became a national conversation. Officials in other states weighed in. Advocacy groups cited the case as evidence of broader systemic issues. Supporters of federal enforcement warned against rushing to judgment, and through it all, one fact remained constant. The investigation was ongoing. No final conclusions had been released, no charges announced, no official timeline provided. Yet public opinion was already forming, on all sides. This case now sits at the intersection of several unresolved national debates: federal versus state authority, immigration enforcement within cities, and the standards used to evaluate use of force. The outcome will likely influence future policy discussions, regardless of the legal conclusion, because even if the investigation ultimately clears the agent involved, the process itself has already reshaped public trust, and once trust is fractured, rebuilding it takes more than a verdict. But Minneapolis was not the only place reacting. As the investigation narrowed, the conversation widened, spilling far beyond city limits. Within days, demonstrations connected to the case appeared in multiple U.S. cities, including New York, Houston, and San Diego. While each gathering had its own local focus, the messaging followed a familiar pattern: calls for accountability, transparency, and a clear framework for how federal enforcement operates within local communities. In many cases, organizers emphasized calm, lawful protest, framing the issue as a civic concern rather than a partisan one. This shift in tone was intentional because the case was no longer just about one incident. It had become a test of institutional trust. Elected officials from both state and federal levels weighed in, often using measured language. Some members of Congress questioned whether existing oversight mechanisms were sufficient when federal agencies investigate their own personnel. Others cautioned against politicizing an active investigation, urging patience and respect for due process. Notably, several leaders stressed the importance of waiting for verified findings, acknowledging that early narratives, once formed, are difficult to reverse. That tension between urgency and restraint defined the political response. One of the most debated aspects of the case wasn't footage or jurisdiction. It was language, how words like self-defense, threat, and terrorism were used, and by whom. Legal experts noted that such terms carry specific definitions that may not align with public interpretation. Once applied publicly, those words can frame an event long before evidence is fully reviewed. And that framing matters, not only in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion. At its core, the FBI-led investigation will attempt to answer several key questions. What did the agent reasonably perceive in that moment? Was the use of lethal force consistent with federal policy? And were alternative actions realistically available? These determinations rely on forensic analysis, expert review, and legal standards, not social media reactions. That process takes time, and until it concludes, many questions will remain open. While institutions debate procedure and authority, a family is grieving. Renee Nicole Good is remembered by those who knew her as a mother of three and an active member of her community. Community leaders emphasized that acknowledging her humanity should not be contingent on the investigation's outcome. This perspective, separating accountability from empathy, has been a recurring theme among local voices. It's a reminder that behind every headline, there are lives permanently changed. Regardless of legal conclusions, this case has already set precedents about how investigations are structured, how quickly narratives form, and how communities respond when transparency is questioned. Future incidents, if they occur, will likely be measured against what happens here. Not because the circumstances are identical, but because expectations have shifted. When federal authority, local governance, and public trust collide, who ultimately ensures accountability? That question does not have a simple answer, and it's one that extends far beyond Minneapolis. This case is still unfolding. As new findings emerge, they may confirm existing narratives or challenge them entirely. In the next video, we'll take a closer look at how federal use of force investigations typically conclude and what past cases can tell us about possible outcomes here. If you want to understand not just what is happening, but how these decisions are made behind the scenes, that analysis is coming next. This is The Public Eye, and we'll continue following the facts as they develop. If this analysis helped you better understand the story, consider liking the video and sharing it with others who want facts over noise. For more in-depth, evidence-based breakdowns like this, subscribe to The Public Eye and stay informed as the story continues.